Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our succession planning and talking about buying and selling funeral homes, which I know is on a lot of your minds right now. A few housekeeping items. No longer do we use the attendance sheet. You are prompted upon registering to include everyone who is sitting in or around your space. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box, which you'll find in the right-hand side of your screen. You'll want to give us about 7 to 10 business days to get your CEUs loaded onto your portal. At this time, I'd like to welcome our presenter today, Melissa Messina, who is co-owner and COO and president of American Funeral Consultants. American Funeral Consultants is one of our member advantage partners. So we welcome Melissa today. Melissa is responsible for all of the financial data processing, forensic analysis, interpretation, and oversight of all appraisal work that is carried out there, among other things. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you for having me. So thank you for joining me today. I also want to give a big thank you to the New York State Funeral Directors Association for the webinar series they provide to members, especially over the last year when in-person meetings have not been able to be held. Their webinars have provided a great and convenient and a safe way to learn some new ideas on a whole variety of subjects while earning some continuing ed credits. So I really do appreciate the opportunity they've provided to AFC for us to present to you today. I think there's going to be plenty of time at the end of this presentation for some Q&A. So as I go through the subject matter, please jot down any questions or comments or whatever you might have. I'll be happy to address them at the end. And I just told Kelly, too, that we just got notified that we have some severe weather coming through between now and 6 p.m. So hopefully Mother Nature holds off and we don't have our technology compromised. So bear with us if that's the case. Right now the skies are clear. So want to talk to you a little bit about succession planning. And succession planning it's defined as a process for identifying and developing internal people with the potential to fill key leadership positions in the company. In other words, it's a sort of replacement planning. And the definition goes on to add that succession planning increases the availability of experienced and capable employees that are prepared to assume these roles as they become available. That definition assumes that there's somebody already involved in the business who's suited to take over the leadership. In the case of a funeral home, this may be a son or a daughter, or it could be a longtime employee. And although in years past this was a much more common occurrence, for many funeral homes today, there may not be a suitable person at your firm who is capable and or willing to take over. And quite frequently, the funeral home owner's children choose some other path. And in some cases, an employee may not want the responsibility. They may not want that financial burden or the risk that's involved in taking over the ownership. Or they may not even have the financial resources necessary to make that purchase. So as an owner, you might be left with no one internally to become your successor. A current estimate is that about 90% of U.S. businesses are family-owned, yet only about 30% or so transition ownership to the second generation. And only about 15% of those go to the third generation. And this rings true in funeral service as well, where most typically younger generations are seeking a different kind of lifestyle from their parents and their grandparents. They remember mom or dad getting up from Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner to make a removal or tend to a family in need. They remember all of those missed ball games and the dance recitals, and they really saw firsthand the 24/7 commitment that is needed. So for this generation, it's been determined that typically money is not the driving force. Instead, time off and flexibility and scheduling have really become increasingly important. And given that, funeral directing and especially becoming an owner of a funeral home is not necessarily the career for a 9-to-5, Monday through Friday oriented person. And what does that mean? Well, it means that executing your own succession plan might be harder than it once was, and that it may require a bit more planning in order for it to be effective and even reasonable. And I recognize that every situation is unique, but sometimes it is necessary to look outside of the company for a successor. And I'm going to talk about several different scenarios throughout this, the webinar. The best defense is a good offense. Well, why plan in the first place? It's fairly simple. Without proper advanced succession planning, you really leave yourself open. You leave yourself open to a potential crisis in the event of an illness or severe disability or a death. You, your family, your business are all unprotected without proper planning. And planning does help to protect you, your family, even your employees, and most of all, your business. It helps to ensure the long-term stability of the firm. It helps to find and groom a suitable successor for your business. It also helps to accomplish a smooth and seamless transition to a new owner to ensure the future success of the business. And this means ensuring that the legacy that you've worked so hard to build is long-lasting. It also helps to see your personal goals come to fruition after a transition. I want to share with you a little bit about AFC's story. And hopefully it helps to drive home why it is so important to plan. So Kathy and I had gone to work for Van Pine. Van is the old owner of AFC. We both went to work for him right out of college for both of us. We had been trained by him, hands-on. He really was the best employer, wonderful man, mentor to both of us. And because of him, our careers flourished. But without realizing it, at some point along our path, Van wasn't enjoying work in the day-to-day aspects of the business anymore. He had a lot of personal things going on. His wife had gotten gravely ill, and it had gotten progressively worse as the years went on. So anyway, I'm going to say probably a little more than 6 years, Kathy and I had taken on an increasingly growing daily role. We really moved from behind the scenes to more visible roles. And by the end of that span of time, we were doing a significant amount of work, really out of pure necessity for Van and what he was tending to. So while we were basically working to pick up the slack wherever we needed to here at AFC, we didn't have our own succession plan. As crazy as that is, it's what we do. We didn't have our own plan. It didn't exist. We'd never verbalized it. We'd never discussed it with Van. He had always been AFC. He was the face of AFC. So in early May of 2004, Van's wife lost her battle, and she died. And that left him feeling very void of wanting to carry on and to continue to do what he'd done for so many years. Now, in the end, it's some 17 years later now, it did work out very well for all of us. But let me tell you, it wasn't without an immense amount of stress and uncertainty for all of us personally, but also the concern for the continuation of the business as well. So our best advice to you is spend some time thinking about what you want in the future. Verbalize your wants and your desires. Talk to your spouse. If you've got partners, employees, spend some time grooming your successor if you've got someone that's a possible successor, but take the time to formalize your succession plan. A succession plan can always be adjusted. It can always be modified if things change, but it really is critical to have a plan. Procrastination. It is the enemy of effective planning. Procrastination can lead you to stop the planning process altogether. If the answers don't come easy, it can also derail you from moving forward. And you could have uncertainty or questions like, can I afford to sell? What will I do when I retire? Planning can help you address these questions so they don't become roadblocks for you. There's a lot of other stumbling blocks that may get in your way. You could have an unwillingness to accept your own aging or your own mortality. We see this often. You may have guilt about transferring the family business to a third party, especially if it's been multi-generational and is now at the end of the line with no family members left to take it on. This is a very emotional component that many owners are faced with, and it can be very distressing. But it shouldn't prevent you from moving forward. You still have to work through it and figure out a way to make a plan. You may have no known successor. This could seem pretty daunting too, but it can be dealt with in a variety of ways if you start to plan. You can have a fear that the business can't be run as well under new ownership, or even have an unwillingness to accept that the business can run well under new ownership, and you just might have an unwillingness to accept that change. I could go on, but these are all common obstacles that really could prevent you from crafting a plan, and we want you to be wary of those issues, whatever they might be for you, that could crop up. And we want you to be ready to dig deep and find answers and find solutions that may not be so easy. So you're probably wondering how to begin. This is probably the hardest part, knowing how and where to start. And I'm going to walk you through some kind of a oversimplified guide to kind of developing your own succession plan. So first, you want to establish your goals. You want to figure out, what do you want to do? What do you plan to do after a sale or transition? You want to create a sort of what we call a wish list of what you envision for yourself for after a sale. You may want to travel. You may want to spend more time with family. You might want to begin a second career. You may look to move out of the area. And then, depending on those goals, you want to ask yourself, how much money am I going to need? Specifically, you're going to need to know how much money is needed to support your goals or plans. So without that wish list, you can't put this in motion. And then you need to ask yourself, can I afford to sell when I'm ready? And if you've got a financial planner, they can be very helpful in calculating what you're going to need to live on. There's going to be some other components that I'm going to discuss in a few minutes that are also going to be critical for you to kind of factor into this equation. And in this initial phase of figuring out how to begin, you're going to want to at least give initial thought to enumerating the options for who your potential successor could be. You could have children involved. You could have other family members. You could have an existing business partner, a longtime employee. It may be your competitor down the street. Or if you don't have a known buyer, it could be an outside buyer, someone who is known to you or perhaps unknown to you. If there's no interest internally, you're going to need to decide whether you're going to offer it, like I said, to a competitor, and that may be completely not within your realm of choice. You may want to think about putting it on the open market to an outside buyer. And again, that could be someone who's independent, an individual. It could be a regional acquirer, or it could be a national acquisition company. That list of outside buyers is going to depend on many features of your firm. So you, at least at this stage, you want to at least give some thought and at least start thinking about each of these possibilities. And as you think about each of these potential buyers, you want to think about their level of competency. And this is easier done if you've got an internal, someone within your organization. Start thinking about, are they competent? What's their level of competency? How committed are they? What's their level of commitment? How motivated are they? Start to assess those sorts of things. Do they have a shared philosophy? These are all sorts of things to think about as they pertain to your potential buyers. And no matter what or who that buyer ends up being, you're going to want to carry out a comprehensive due diligence process on that buyer. We're going to get into this in a lot more detail later on, but they, as your buyer, are going to be doing their own very thorough due diligence on you and your firm, of course. You want to make sure you do your homework on them too. And again, I'm going to get into more details on that as we get working through this information, but just want you to start to think about that. So I hope by now I've driven home the idea that a good succession plan is going to be most effective when it's strategically planned, not when it's thrown together or has to be executed at the 11th hour, not in the face of death or sickness or some disability or some other sort of major upheaval in your life. There should be a lot of prior planning. And it's important to realize that this can be a lengthy process with a lot of moving parts. So it is wise to start early. And that kind of leads me into the next couple of points here. Establish a reasonable time frame for accomplishing your goals. First, you want to understand the process and just how long it could take. And then you want to set a time frame for your retirement. And then you want to kind of work backwards to initiate your plan. And then you got to get busy. And so during this time, you're going to want to start to think about grooming your business, taking the time to understand your firm from the top to the bottom, looking at your income and your costs, your expenses, call volume, your percentage of market share, on and on. There's all kinds of things that you can begin to have a better understanding. And then you want to take some steps to make improvements and do whatever you can to strengthen your operation. You want to continue to give thought as this develops to who your potential successors might be. And as you work on your plan, this list of buyers is going to develop more fully. So I'm going to continue to discuss it throughout, but this list is eventually, it's going to evolve as you work through all of this and you get to your final end stage of looking to sell. So if you've got someone in-house, whether this is a family member or a longtime employee that you envision as your potential successor, meet with them and formally introduce the idea. This serves as a couple of purposes. Number one, it's going to let them know that you have definitive plans to transfer the business to them at some point. You may have a longtime employee who doesn't think they're ever going to have an opportunity to buy, and they may begin to seek other opportunities. We've seen this happen a lot. And two, it's going to help you determine their level of interest. They may not be interested at all. They may be your planned successor, but they may not want it. And that's just as important to know as if they were interested. So we really suggest that you take some time to discuss each other's plans and goals. Also want you to give some thought to grooming your successor. If it's someone from within the firm, within the business, you can start to transition some of the operational, maybe some of the managerial tasks that you do. You could have them shadow some of the things that you do as an owner. And then according to your time frame, you can determine just how much of that operational control you're willing and ready to hand over to them. And you can determine when that is. It depends upon your needs. But by doing so, your successor can slowly take on those day-to-day responsibilities and be better prepared for when you are ready to completely retire. So when is it time to retire? Figuring out a desirable date or an age of retirement may be easy, or it could be a very difficult decision for you. It depends on your own needs and your own goals. However, doing so is going to help you pinpoint a definitive time frame that's going to be critical for your planning needs. So when thinking about that date for retirement, think about this. Your after-sale role, what do you desire? Give some thought to what you want this to be. For example, let's say you want to be totally retired, completely out of the business by the time you're 60. Well, you need to consider that a new owner is likely going to require you to stick around, maybe for 6 months, maybe 3 months, maybe a year, but possibly even up to 1 or 2, maybe even 3 years after a sale. So you may need to adjust your time frame to accommodate for this. And that relates directly to what I discussed earlier when I said set your time frame and then work backward to set your plan in place. So if you want to walk out the door at the age of 60 and be totally done, you need to back up your time frame a little bit to allow some time for that transition. So maybe a sale at 59 might be more reasonable to get you out the door at 60. So I want you to be prepared and know what to expect, and then set your time frame accordingly. And you may wish to work for a new owner for a couple of years. You may wish for that transition period to be as short as possible. And all of this is going to be important for you to think about and know what you're comfortable with. And also, at some point down the road, be prepared to discuss this because you're going to need to know what a new owner may require. And most importantly, you need to incorporate all of that into your plan. So early in this process, you're going to want to assemble what we call your A-team. And these are your hand-picked professionals, your attorney, your accountant, your appraiser, that all should work collaboratively toward achieving your goals. So let's start with your attorney. Your attorney is going to fill a variety of roles. It's likely that you've worked with one for years to handle general issues, for you, provide basic legal guidance, and these are things like evaluating any legal issues that may have cropped up over the years, preparing or even updating your will, handling your estate planning, establishing durable powers of attorney, providing authority to someone to make financial and legal decisions, and do financial transactions on your behalf for your good and for the good of the business. And then that's certainly important in the event that you're not able to do it yourself. Basic things, set healthcare directives and healthcare proxies, and maybe you've got family involved and you want to have a creative legal trust to protect a legal trust. These are fairly basic legal matters that should all be in proper order no matter what. However, in preparation for a sale, it's critical to have an attorney who's skilled in succession planning, tax law, and who's highly skilled and well-versed in transacting sales. In choosing a transaction attorney, you're going to want somebody who's going to protect your interests, but you also want somebody who's going to be cooperative and be able to work with opposing counsel and your other advisors as well. And although this part may not come until later in your plan, you do need to be prepared and figure out who you're going to use when the time is right. And then once a buyer has been selected, the attorneys are going to work together to do all sorts of things. They're going to be preparing contracts, filing paperwork, and handling other legal matters that come about. But a good transaction attorney should also deal with your real estate, deeds, making sure you've got clear title, handling any encroachment issues, easements, you name it. We really want you to deal with this, I'm going to call it stuff, in advance. If you know that some problems exist, please deal with it. Don't let a lender, surveyor, or the title company or the environmental report discover it just prior to closing. That's a surefire way to put a wrench into a deal and delay closing. So, for example, if you know you had an oil spill or maybe a gas leak or something like that, and remediation was done, but it was years ago and you can't find the paperwork, find it. Figure out how to get that documentation. You're absolutely going to need it. Let's say you know that your fence encroaches on the neighbor's property. Deal with it now. If you know you have asbestos-wrapped pipes in your funeral home's basement, deal with it. These are all examples of issues that are going to be discovered, but it's not going to happen until weeks just before closing. So, obviously there may be issues that you're absolutely unaware of, and those can't necessarily be controlled. But if you are aware that a problem exists, definitely speak up. Tell your advisors and figure out a way to rectify that matter and have it documented before sale time. So let's talk a little bit about your accountant, and they're going to serve a variety of needs for your financial issues, let's say. Their number one job is going to be to evaluate your books and records. Your accounting information should be clear, should be detailed. If you've got financial statements that you prepare or that they prepare, that'll be super. Their tax returns, everything should be as accurate as they can be. Your accountant, if you've got a bookkeeper, really should sit down together and create a clear understanding of everything, really, from your income, your costs, your expenses, right down to the base level where that income is posted and the checks are written and classified into various categories. There's really no misclassification of categories of expense, and cash advances should be clearly identified. So if you include your bookkeeper, or whoever the one is who writes those checks, and that's hopefully the same individual who enters it into QuickBooks, there's much less chance for error. The way we see it is that with everyone on the same page, you're going to have greater continuity in your record keeping, and that's pretty important, especially in thinking about what your future plans are going to be. So your accountant, with your help, also ought to help identify any personal or owner discretionary expenses that would be not necessarily continue with the sale. And these are going to be important to identify and list, especially for sale purposes. This is really important, and I'm going to get into it in some more detail as we go along. Your accountant also should weigh in on any issues that are unique to your firm, and they ought to be able to discuss and maybe even resolve them with you. For example, and we see this quite often, maybe you've got a lot of old receivables or bad debts on the books. Maybe it's better to just write them off and be done with them. Maybe your corporation status is outdated and maybe it's not best suited to you tax-wise. Are you still a C Corp? Does it make sense to switch? Is there enough time between now and your end date when you're really looking to transition to make that worth it? Maybe the real estate is owned by the corporation. Is it better to separate it out? Does it make sense to put it into an LLC? There are all kinds of questions to be asked, and there's advantages and disadvantages to all of these things. But we want you to discuss it with your accountant and determine what is best for you. Your accountant is also going to be the one to analyze the tax implications of the sale. They're going to look at federal, state tax. They're also going to, if you've done any intrafamilial gift, sharing, they're going to be the ones to determine the ramifications of those federal, estate, and gift taxes if you've done any gifting. And in the near final stages of your sale, your accountant is really going to be the one to make that allocation of purchase price. And that is going to allow for the most tax advantageous structure that you can reasonably achieve. So at that point, that's going to be, a really critical issue. We'll talk a little bit about your appraiser. That's the final member of your A team, and their main task is going to be to determine the firm's market value. An industry appraiser is going to provide you with the most accurate value, and that really is an absolute must-have. Your succession plan depends on it. So whatever you hope to do, whatever you plan for, having an accurate value is really critical. An appraiser ought to be thorough. They ought to use forensic accounting skills to find items in your financials maybe that need clarification. And they should eagerly work with you and your accountant to address any issues, questions, talk about any discrepancies that might be found. Your appraiser is also going to help identify the owner discretionary expenses and any one-time expenses that have been run through the business. These could consist of expenses for, it could be for the replacement of a roof, maybe a new furnace. It could be for the paving of a parking lot. You get the idea. These are important to know because in a sale, they can and should be added back to the firm's projected future cash flow, since they wouldn't be expected to recur. So typically your appraiser is going to be helpful in unearthing questions that will help you and your accountant work together to produce really the necessary quantification of that data needed. So for example, you're going to need to know how much did you spend for each of these items and when and what year. So for example, let's say in 2009, I spent $17,000 for a new roof. In 2018, I had HVAC repairs and replacements to the tune of, $12,000. And, these are details that your appraiser is going to need in order to nail these down for you. Your appraiser ought to also have razor-sharp skills to help find and understand your firm's cash advances. And honestly, cash advances could be a topic in and of itself, but to keep it short, when I use the term cash advances, I'm really referring to what are typically items like flowers, obituaries, death notices, cemetery expenses for grave openings and closings, hairdressers, tips for clergy, that sort of thing. These are cash advances that should not be mixed with other items of expense, and it's so important. Cash advances should be a category in and of themselves. They should absolutely not be mixed with other items of expense. There's no profits made. There's no markups on cash advances. It's just money laid out and paid as a convenience for the family. And that also means that they're not a true source of revenue because there's no profit made. So these are truly just cash in, cash out. So if you make a profit on any of those items that I mentioned, these are not cash advances and they're not subject to this particular discussion. What I'm talking about is a true cash advance where there's no profit made. So my main point here is that an industry appraiser should fully understand what cash advances are, and they should know how to handle them. They can also be instrumental in helping the bookkeeper and the accountant understand why they need to be categorized separately from your other items of costs and expenses. Because if they're not properly handled, they could very easily skew the market value of your firm, and that's pretty critical. Okay, so let's move on from cash advances. Your appraiser also should identify any commingled or even misidentified expenses. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, let's say embalming fluid and small tools and equipment for the embalming room. These are not office supplies. To us, they're very different. So another area where the most commingled expenses are found in cost of goods sold, specifically what makes up the firm's purchases. In most, not all, but in most firms that we look at, this is frequently a catch-all for a lot of costs and expenses that aren't really purchases. So a good industry appraiser is going to know the questions to ask. They're going to know when it looks off, or a little bit out of whack, and they're going to understand how to identify and clarify these other items and reclassify them into categories so that the firm's true cost of goods sold is known. And this is likely going to take some work, but they're going to expect to work together with you and your accountant, but it really is important for the ultimate goal here is getting clean and accurate records. This whole process of identification is going to help you. It's going to help your bookkeeper, hopefully help your accountant for your future record keeping, especially if the books and records need to be cleaned up. And this demonstrates another good reason to start early, really, so that you've got time to clean these records up before you're ready to sell. Importantly, your appraiser and your accountant ought to work hand in hand to address any and all of these issues. So when the time comes to set the value, it's going to be based on accurate data. And all of that behind the scenes work, it really might seem like a pain in the butt to you, but it's really going to help to maximize the projected cash flow of your firm, which in turn is going to help to maximize the overall value of it when you're ready to sell. So there's other factors to consider when selling or buying a funeral home. Let's focus on selling a funeral home. Is it the right time to sell, and how do you know? Well, how are you feeling? Are you experiencing burnout? Are you physically, emotionally exhausted? Looking at things right now, if an owner was ready before this last year of COVID, it's likely that they're on the ledge right now. So if you feel that you're getting burned out, it's time to step up and put a plan in motion. You don't want to wait until you want it out yesterday. That potentially puts you in a very compromised situation, and that's what we're trying to avoid. You might be feeling that you have inefficacy or maybe decreased job function. Have you failed to keep up with the times? Maybe you've lost call volume because you've been unable to find new ways to market your firm. Maybe you've not embraced using social media or non-traditional means of advertising. Are you feeling like a dinosaur when it comes to serving your families in today's marketplace? Or maybe you failed to keep up with your competitor by, offering new ways to commemorate death. There could be all kinds of reasons why you might feel like you are ineffective and maybe not able to function like you once could. You can have health problems, both mental, physical, and these could significantly interfere with job performance. Have you reached the pinnacle of your career? Do you want to retire at the top of your game? Have you brought your firm to an exceptional level and now want to cash in at maximum value? Maybe you want to pursue a second career. We see that quite often. Have you had enough of funeral service and really want to move on and pursue something different? What are your hopes and plans for retirement? I briefly discussed this a little bit earlier, but now is really the time to think about yourself and how much longer you wish to work in that capacity. Are you looking to continue working for a new owner in a reduced capacity? Does that sound good to you? Do you love being a funeral director but want to work less hours, maybe have less day-to-day responsibility? Maybe you just want to relocate. Maybe you're just looking for relaxation and recreation. Really want to give some thought to what you want, not just for yourself, but it's going to be important for a buyer to know what you want or what you expect after a sale. However, we talked about this a little bit earlier. You also have to understand that a new owner is likely going to require you to stay on for at least some period of time to help with the transition. But our thoughts are, if going into a sale, you can express your expectations, it helps to start the dialogue with a buyer to make sure they are at least somewhat aligned with what their expectations are. So that's pretty important to give that some thought so that you can verbalize that. Are you ready, willing, and able to give up control of the business? If you're approaching the time to sell, you really do need to get your mental game in order too. You can't successfully transition if you're not really, really ready in your heart and your mind to make that leap and give up that control. And giving some thought to these ideas in advance helps you prepare emotionally to avoid seller's remorse and any hostilities that might develop after a sale. And maintaining your lifestyle. This is like a puzzle, and you're going to be the one to put together all the pieces of it. So let's go back to some earlier questions that I hope you can answer a little bit more thoroughly now. The first one, how much do I need to live on when I retire? Well, you're going to rely on your advisors that you've hand-selected. Your accountant and your financial advisor are going to play a really important role here. You want to work with them because you need to know. You've got to know this answer, determine if selling is even reasonable to think about for you right now. Question number 2, how do I become more knowledgeable and informed? Your homework is your planning. That's really how you become prepared and how you gain that knowledge. And that's only done by proceeding through this methodically. The third question, what is your business worth? Well, you should have an answer now. You've got an appraiser that's going to provide this for you, and knowing what your firm is worth is an absolutely critical step in this process. You can't easily piece together a solid succession plan, that being your puzzle. You can't piece that together without knowing what your business is worth. Timing is everything. In funeral service, is the climate conducive to a sale? Financial considerations, let's talk about that. Are you faced with, in your market area, are you faced with changing demographics? They could be improving, they could be declining, they could be holding steady. How do you compare to neighboring communities? And how does your town compare to that of New York State, to the United States? You want to look at things like your population, how has it changed over the last 5 to 10 years? Median age, your median household income, or even your per capita income. Poverty rates, things like ethnic and religious factors, and so much more. But you really want to get a good handle on your demographics and how they're changing, and if they're changing. Increases and decreases in call volume. Do you know the number of deaths in your county or in your market area? Do you know your percentage of market share? You should know, is it growing? Is it declining? Have you held pretty steady? That's all important to know. What has been the effect of increased cremation on your revenues? And now for 2020, we got to consider the impact of COVID on revenues and call volume. In a lot of instances, call volume is up through the roof, and revenues have really, really flattened out. And we're faced with the uncertainty of what's to come in 2021 and in the future. We ask ourselves this all the time. We have dialogue about this a lot. Will families recognize that being deprived of those commemorative services, has it left them feeling void of a good funeral experience? Will we ever get back to a more quote-unquote traditional way of celebrating death? Or is this going to become the new norm? That remains to be seen, but it is going to play a factor in determining if the climate is conducive to a sale right now or in the future. The lending climate. It's going to be important to understand what that lending climate is in the industry when it comes time for you to sell. what it's like right now may be very different than it might be, say 3 to 5 years down the road. But it is important to be cognizant of this and kind of get a pulse for what that might be as you are nearing that sale, the time for a sale. You also want to look at the current versus the future value of your firm. Should you cash out now or should you hold on for longer? And what I mean by that is your firm's value decreasing? If so, it could be due to a number of factors, but it could be due to a decline in your percentage of market share or specific funeral trends over the last few years. If your demographics are changing for the worst, and you've got an increase in direct cremation, maybe you've got decreased merchandise sales. If so, and if you're not willing to invest what it takes to turn it around, then don't delay. Don't delay a sale expecting that your value is miraculously going to increase if it's already on a steady decline that you're unable or unwilling to stop. Maybe it's increasing. Maybe you've had, maybe you've had an aggressive pre-need campaign, let's say, that's finally starting to show a return for your investment. Maybe you've had a strong aftercare program that's finally taking off and reaching folks that you've never been able to target. Or maybe you've steadily been drawing call volume from your competitor, and that's going to continue for the next couple of years. In some cases, your firm may not have yet reached its full potential. So whether you're on the decline, incline, you're holding steady, it's important to know how your business is trending. And this information can be really helpful to you in strategizing and determining when and if the time is right for you. So who is going to be the heir to your throne? Hopefully by now, you've given some thought to the options that you have. You want to give some consideration to who your prospective buyers are going to be. I know we talked about this earlier and how important it is to communicate with your potential successor if you've got someone in-house. You don't want them to slip away as a potential buyer just because you've just not communicated with them. Don't let that happen. The easiest answer often is having a family member, an employee, a business partner to transition to. However, for many, you don't have these as viable options. So if that's the case, you're really going to need to start thinking a little bit more thoroughly about who you would consider selling to. Have you really given thought to the competitor? Our quick answer is nope, never gonna do it. Think about these in a little bit more detail. Maybe that's the best fit. Maybe it's not. There's a lot of independent buyers out there who are looking to make a good acquisition. A lot of people out there, a lot of folks looking for a good funeral home to buy. It could be a regional player or it could be an acquisition company. Regardless of your options, and there are many, you really want to start thinking about each of these prospects more seriously and how they may or may not fit with you and your business. And again, you may need to step out of your comfort zone with some of this, but it is worth the time to really start coming to terms with who that successor might be or who the potential successors for your business might be. Your best tool is to be prepared. Advanced planning is critical. It really is important. There's so many tasks to tend to, it really can be overwhelming. But if you stay focused and you take it step by step and you do one thing at a time, you really can accomplish your goals. So how exactly can you get this done? The honest answer is that you're going to need help. You're going to need help from your advisors. Their help is going to be critical through this entire process in a variety of ways. I already discussed how important your accountant, your attorney, or appraiser will be to this entire process, and I think I've hopefully made that clear. But I want to focus now on some specific things that are going to have to be done as you get close to sale. It's not intended to overwhelm you. It's really just to drive home the fact that if you're trying to run a business, it's close to impossible to do all of this stuff yourself. So you want to make sure that your advisors, these folks that you've brought on board, you want to make sure that these advisors are equipped to help you in the most productive of ways. in your effort to seek maximum value from your advisors, because ultimately that's what you want. You want to get the biggest bang for your buck out of your advisors. It's important to know the full scope of what's going to be necessary. So when we look at this from your accountant, your attorney, your appraiser, they all have certain skill sets. Now, some of these are going to overlap, but they're all going to help you navigate the process more smoothly. And as we get into this next section, you're going to see the scope of things that are going to need to be done heading into and during and even after a sale. So all of this is being presented to you so that you're prepared and that you know when to ask for help. And importantly, the way we look at this is often an industry appraiser can also serve as an intermediary and help you tackle these issues and then some. However, I think it's really important to get comfortable with your appraiser and really know what they're capable of and find out their depth of service and their attention to detail, because there's really going to be a lot to handle. So let's talk about the many hats of an intermediary, I'm going to explain how an intermediary can be much more than a broker, but also I want to demonstrate the depth of service that is needed in a sale. So if you have an intermediary to help you through this process, yours should serve to help you in many ways that I'm going to explain. But at the same time, if you're going to do this yourself, pay close attention, because these are all of the tasks that are going to need to be done as you lead through the process of selling. Coordinator. So if time allows, you should put together your A team of advisors probably 2 to 3 years prior to a contemplated sale. That's a pretty good timeline. You'll likely already have your accountant, so you want to make sure that he or she is well equipped to handle what is to come. And there's a lot of work to be done. And all of your parties, all of your, your attorney, your accountant, your appraiser, everybody should work collaboratively and cooperatively. However, an intermediary working on your behalf is also going to serve as that professional go-between. They're going to be the coordinator. They're going to be the one to keep everybody on the same page and everybody working toward the same goal. A groomer, preparing your business for its sale, making adjustments to things like maybe it's your general price list, maybe it's your offering of services or your merchandise. What things can help to bolster the income for your firm? You want to examine and gain a better understanding of your costs and your expenses. I know we talked about this a bit before. Do whatever is necessary to tighten your budget and make specific recommendations. They're going to help you pare down costs and expenses in a reasonable way. They're also going to help you track and minimize owner discretionary expenses. In reality, you're probably not going to want to stop taking all of these owner discretionary expenses for tax purposes, and that's okay. But what you do need to do is start to keep track of them. And an intermediary is going to help with identifying those specific expenses, and they're going to keep a list of what was spent in what year. And in a sale, your intermediary is going to add these expenses back to your projected cash flow. But if you can't prove them, if you can't prove that you spent X dollars in X year, they're not going to be accepted by the buyer or their accountant, or especially their lender. So again, you're going to need to be specific. So, if you took $35,000 bonus, or you spent $1,000 for your spouse's car, if you, if you paid $750 for your kid's car repair, or $3,000 for your home heating oil, those sorts of things, whatever those owner discretionary expenses might be, you want to track them so that they can be quantified. And your intermediary is going to take the lead on this, which is going to help a lot. They're going to document it as needed, but they're also going to need your help to identify what you spent. So this is also a time, to make some improvements and track what you spend. But this is a time to, if it needs it, to be spiffed up, facility inside and out. But again, you want to make sure that the things that you start to do or that you've done over the years, you want to keep track of those. You want to maximize your profitability. Again, I realize that for tax purposes, you might not want to post big profits, but you're going to need to be able to demonstrate that your business is, or that it has the potential to be profitable. So between enhancing your service, and your merchandise offerings, let's say, and maybe tweaking your GPL a little bit on the income side to tightening your budget a bit, and also, of course, keeping track of these owner discretionary and extraordinary expenses. Your intermediary should be able to demonstrate and prove that your firm is profitable. And this is going to become extremely important when it comes to asking for and negotiating maximum sale price. Your guardian, the protector of your interests. 1 to 2 years in advance, you should have already started to construct your wish list. We talked about that early on. These are the things that you hope for after sale. Now it's time to really take that list and start to finalize it. You want to give consideration to a lot of different things, your objective facts, emotional sentiments. You want to lay them out so that they're known, and you want to share them with your trusted advisors, and especially with your intermediary if you're using one, because they can help you navigate according to these factors because they're important to you. So your intermediary alongside of your accountant should lay out and estimate a desired sale price. And then your accountant's job is going to be able to, they're going to be able to begin to look at the after-tax implications of it. And together, looking at what's reasonable to anticipate, you'll learn what you'll be able to net from the sale, from the purchase price, versus how that compares to what you actually need to live on. And that's going to be important to know. So as your guardian, your intermediary is going to be the voice of reason. They're going to help begin to put together a plan to try and make this all come together. And based on all of this information, your intermediary can work on laying out some proposed points for prospective future deal. And that includes the desired structure of the sale, your potential continuing employment under under the new ownership. And of course, this is going to be dependent upon what you've determined you want. Part-time, no embalming, no being on call, no weekends, all those sorts of things are going to be critical to lay out specifically at this point. They're also going to take a look at your assets to be included in the sale, as well as those that are going to be excluded from the sale. Personal effects, artwork, historical pictures, maybe a spouse's car, a laptop, whatever these assets might be. You want to make them clearly specified so there's no false expectations of the buyer. And sometimes there are assets that could be on loan so that the new owner for a period of time maybe can continue to use them or what have you until they have the time to replace them. Let's say it's the firm's history and photos and newspaper print and things like that are all framed throughout the facility. It may be pretty important for continuity for the new owner to keep those things on display. Even if you're going to retain ownership, you may think about allowing that new owner to display such things for some period of time. You also want to be reasonable here. You don't want to strip out every vehicle owned by the business. You don't want to take out every piece of computer equipment, all the office equipment. There's got to be some balance. If a new owner needs to come in and replace a whole lot of critical equipment, you're going to need to be flexible in decreasing the purchase price to accommodate for those extraordinary items because they are going to have to outlay money to purchase them. So your intermediary is going to help you strike a balance here. Some other things, if you need health insurance or other benefits, that all ought to be discussed. Continued employment of your staff members under new ownership. Your intermediary can help market the importance of your staff to potential buyers. There's a fine line. They may or may not stay, but if they are valued employees, your intermediary ought to be able to convey that to prospective purchasers. Good employees, especially licensed staff, are very hard to come by. So all of these are important issues that you should have a say about. However, if you don't spend time thinking about them and verbalizing them and talking about what you want, if left undetermined, you're really at the mercy of the buyer to determine these issues for you, and you're going to likely regret that pretty quickly. So let's talk about the role of your auditor. With your team of advisors, your intermediary is going to take the lead in performing their due diligence. And especially as it nears closing, they're going to ensure that there's no surprises. they're going to review a tremendous number of issues, and they and your other advisors are going to tend to making sure everything is in order. And this includes, this list could go on and on, but some of the main kind of key things that are going to need to be covered: your pre-funded pre-need accounts, making sure that's all in order. Your real estate, oftentimes there are numerous parcels that make up the usable real estate of the funeral home. It's going to be important to have all of those parcels clearly identified, with a section, lot, and block number for each, and it's also important to understand the property tax and the assessed values of each of those parcels, those sorts of real estate issues. Your automotive equipment, your furniture, fixtures, and equipment, your included and your excluded assets, the assets that are to be included in your sale are going to include a room-by-room listing of all the furniture, fixtures, and equipment in the building. So that's a pretty monumental task. It's a lot, but it is going to be something that is necessary. A listing of your accounts receivable, your accounts payable, merchandise inventory, caskets, vaults, urns, clothing, keepsakes, that sort of thing. And then any structural, title, environmental issues, which will hopefully not turn up too much as you get close to closing. So your appraiser will already have provided you with an answer to a very important question: how much is my business worth? A purchase price, or at least an idea of what a reasonable purchase price is, should be established using a valuation, that's the appraisal, using that appraisal as a baseline. There's no reason why you can't seek more than the appraised value, but knowing what is affordable based on the firm's cash flow is really important, so that you've got reasonable expectations going into a sale process. I can't tell you how many times we have unreasonable expectations of a seller, and that can be very, very disappointing. So this is really important. An appraisal done for sale purposes is typically done using the EBIT, which is the earnings before interest, depreciation, and taxes, or the cash flow method. And this is primarily based on the income producing potential and the cash flow ability of the firm. And your intermediary can help set a value for the sale and really be the one charged with getting maximum value for it. Your protector. Your intermediary should ensure and maintain complete confidentiality by executing non-disclosure agreements with all buyers, whether they're known or unknown to you. Sometimes for an owner, it can be really uncomfortable asking a longtime employee or a familiar buyer to sign an agreement of non-disclosure. When buyers are unknown to you, it can equally be important to be certain that they understand how critical it is to maintain the confidentiality of this. So it's often an uneasy task for sellers to demand of their buyers, but for an intermediary, it's their job. They're accustomed to being adamant and professional and really strict about the adherence to such agreements. And it's easy for an owner to point a finger at their intermediary and just say, hey, they made me do it. I don't mean to make light of this, but it really is nice in certain situations to be able to defer the uncomfortable situations to your intermediary and not even get involved. It just takes you out of the middle altogether. And this leads me to my next point. When your intermediary deals directly with the buyers, it allows you to tend to your business, not have any distractions from it. And importantly, it also prevents you getting calls at your business, which can lead employees to become suspicious that something is going on before you're ready to, to really sit down with them and let them know what's going on. Most intermediaries insist that all inquiries be directed through them as the one point of contact, and that's a really good aspect of it. And this part of the process is very difficult to take on when you're doing it alone. An intermediary is used to this role. They're used to being thick-skinned and really taking the brunt of uneasy conversations. It's what they're accustomed to doing. And it should be one of their top priorities to be the one to protect your identity and to make sure that your potential suitors respect and fully understand how serious this whole process is. So your worker bee, doing the footwork. Your intermediary should be doing the lion's share of the behind-the-scenes work to help you get ready to sell. And this means that they will be the one to keep everybody on task, and that means you included. Your intermediary is going to be the one to make sure that everything is getting done, everything's in order, and they're going to iron out discrepancies, whether it be in financials or whatever happens to crop up. They're going to sift through all of the issues that we've discussed today and get you to the point where you're ready, like really ready for the sale. One of the tasks at this time is the preparation of an informational report for use with prospective buyers. This is a major task. We do a report that we call an informational prospectus, and we use it as a marketing tool. But no matter who prepares it, this report is often highly proprietary and should contain a lot of pertinent information that's needed by the buyer and his or her advisor and lender. But because it's so proprietary in nature, buyers must be cleared and demonstrate a seriousness and also prove themselves to be a bona fide buyer. Again, falling back on that protector's role that we talked about a few minutes ago, this is critical to ensuring the information doesn't get into the wrong hands. So it's got to be handled carefully, and best efforts must be made to ensure that your information remains confidential. An intermediary is going to use a database of buyers to help identify and find prospective buyers and also assess their ability to do a deal. Part of the footwork to be done here is the construction of a list of potential buyers. The seller should have some input here early on. That's something that hopefully you began to think about, and hopefully it has evolved from that first point of consideration. So you're going to have names to include and exclude from that list. Your intermediary is going to add to that list based on buyers in their database, from those they know, some that they may have met here and there or know that would potentially be interested. And together, you're going to decide whether to start small with a select few, or to open it to the to the open market. And there are pros and cons to both, and that should be discussed thoroughly based on your own personal situation. So your marketer. Your intermediary should create and finalize that list of potential buyers, and you ought to have final approval on that. They ought to distribute the marketing tools to buyers, and what we call the informational prospectus. And in their role as protector, your intermediary will have prepared non-disclosure agreements for all buyers, and only when those have been signed and returned do detailed discussions begin with buyers. At least that's how we handle it. And during this phase of readying a firm to be marketed, once that buyer has demonstrated their ability and their willingness and their desire to make a purchase, then it's often time to distribute that marketing tool to them, because then they've kind of qualified themselves in a variety of ways as a bona fide buyer. And it's important to note that not everybody that was on that original list makes it through to this stage. Set marketing methods. Sometimes it's necessary to advertise. Sometimes we need to expand that potential buyer pool. This is often very effective, but it should be done to protect the firm's identity. So when we run an ad, there's no town name, there's no firm name. There might be a mention of a region or a state or a county if it's not too identifying. Maybe the average number of calls, average revenues, long history of service in, XYZ part of New York State, that sort of thing. We really try not to divulge too much information where a buyer could figure out who you are. The negotiator. The expertise and role of an intermediary really comes into play here. Negotiation skills specifically. In terms of purchase price, you don't want to leave money on the table, obviously, and knowing how to balance what's affordable to the buyer with getting top dollar for the seller. Now, as a seller, you might be saying, I don't care what's affordable, but being affordable really is important for the long-term success of the business. It's also important because if the buyer needs a loan and that lender is going to shoot it down because that value is too high, if it's deemed to be unaffordable, then you're not in a very good situation. So A good negotiator is going to know how to stretch that upper limit of affordability and ensure that you get the most for your firm. And once a buyer is ready to make their offer, an intermediary can assist them in the preparation of a letter of intent to formalize their offer. And there may be multiple letters of intent. You know, if you've got multiple buyers, you may have multiple LOIs to examine, and your intermediary is going to negotiate and do counter proposals and get counter offers, and ultimately a buyer is going to be selected based on the price and terms that are negotiated. I'm going to go get into in a couple more minutes. I'm going to get back to a letter of intent just to give you a little bit more information on that. As a negotiator, your intermediary ought to have the ability to work collaboratively with others. That's an absolute must. There's going to be a lot of moving parts. There's going to be accountants on both sides. There's going to be a lender involved, attorneys on both sides, inspections, surveyors to coordinate. Oh God, and we have terrible weather coming through right now, so please bear with me if we if we cut out. Also, having the ability to negotiate with all parties. They're oftentimes they're called in to quell hostilities, ease frustrations, and really keep everyone moving toward an acceptable deal. It really does take some effort, and sometimes it's not so easy. Assistance with negotiating the structure of a transaction for best terms, not just the best price. And this may mean working into the agreement some terms that are not so typical, maybe unique to you and your particular circumstance. But being able to communicate with all parties to convey ideas and strategies can be very valuable and really essential to this whole process. At a certain stage in the negotiations, it's imperative for that negotiator to work closely with the lender. And this is going to be on behalf of the buyer, but they're going to be called upon to provide needed information, answer questions, prove add-backs to the cash flow, explain and enumerate the owner discretionary expenses that we've hopefully worked so hard to separate out. And, basically they're going to keep the deal moving with that lender. Also, with open lines of communication with the lender comes information about how the deal is progressing. And this can be really helpful. Sometimes when it appears that there is no activity, they're really working diligently on some aspect of the loan. We just don't see it. And it is easy to become disheartened and quite frustrated if you think that nothing's being done. So it really is good to have someone with kind of, as we say it, with feet on both sides of the deal, just to have a pulse for what is really going on behind the scenes. And your support system. At some point in any deal, both the seller and the buyer need reassurance. So having knowledge of how it's all progressing is really helpful in allaying concerns and addressing issues as they come up. A perfect match. Once the buyer has been determined and the loan process is well underway, what happens next? Well, that's the time to begin the preparation of agreements, and it's time to bring in your transaction attorney. And I want to get back to the letter of intent here. By this point, the letter of intent should already be submitted, negotiated, signed. Just a couple points that I want to make. Most of the terms in a letter of intent are non-binding. The letter of intent is used to prepare the purchase and sale agreement. So there's two ways to approach a letter of intent. It can be very detailed, or it can be brief. There's pros and cons to both. We really prefer a detailed letter of intent for a variety of reasons. Primarily, we think a detailed LOI helps to iron out a lot of issues way early on in the process. I don't know, that can be so helpful. And to add to that, it also makes the preparation of the purchase and sale agreement so much easier because the majority of the terms and conditions and the sticking points are already spelled out and agreed upon in the letter of intent. So it really helps, a more detailed letter of intent, in my opinion, helps to make the purchase and sale agreement process go much, much quicker. Again, the letter of intent is generally non-binding. It does have a few binding issues, cease negotiations and the confidentiality and things like that. We typically like to see a good faith deposit requirement. It could be nominal. It could be anywhere up to, it could be anything you want it to be. We typically see it, some nominal amount up to a 10%, just to hold the buyer's feet to the fire. And it's reasonable, given that the seller is going to be taking the firm off the market. It is reasonable to want to have a good faith deposit, and that typically is refundable in a very few instances. There's typically some clauses in there for that being refundable, but typically that's a good idea to have a good faith deposit. And the LOI typically lays out the structure of the transaction. So in the addition to the purchase price, it's going to provide how much cash at closing, if there's to be a seller's note, and that sort of thing. So legal contracts. Whose attorney is going to draft them? It can go either way. There's benefits of having your attorney do the first draft. That way you can make sure you get in everything that you wish to include. If you're looking to save expenses, let the other side do it. As long as you know your attorney is going to be going through this with a fine-tooth comb, it could be handled either way. Purchase and sale agreements. They're going to be lengthy, and they should definitely include all the points covered in the letter of intent and then some. And it is important to have your intermediary review it for funeral-specific clauses, and your accountant can weigh in with the allocation of purchase price. This really is a joint effort. By the time you get to this purchase and sale agreement, it's definitely a joint effort by all of your trusted advisors to help ensure that you're well protected and that you have the most tax advantageous deal possible. So let's talk a little bit about covenant not to compete, the CNC. Typically, it's a 5 or maybe a 10-year agreement. Depending on where you're situated, it could be a 25-mile radius, it could be a 50-mile radius. And basically, you're going to be expected not to compete in funeral service anywhere near that funeral home, for the foreseeable future. That said, it does need to be fair and not too terribly restricting. And negotiating this can sometimes be a little bit tenuous, but it is important to work it out so that it's mutually agreeable. We really like to do this hashing out of the CNC in the letter of intent. So it's already argued about, it's already discussed, it's already determined, and you can just roll it right into the purchase and sale agreement. A seller's note. Most independent buyers are not going to have $200,000-$300,000 just sitting in their pocket ready to put down on a deal. If they've worked as a funeral director, chances are they've not been able to amass a big chunk of change. So to help offset the cash down payment that they're going to need to put down on a deal, the seller is often asked to hold some sort of a seller's note. Most often, that seller's note is fairly small, maybe 10, maybe 20% of the purchase price, depending upon the sale and the situation. However, it's important to know that the terms of the seller's note will be most often dictated by the lender. And although you might not have much control over it, it is really important to fully understand how that note can be repaid to you. So, as an example, if you're counting on that as part of your purchase price, if you're counting on that to live on, and we talked early on about determining how much you're going to need to live in retirement, and if you're not going to receive all of that money until you're 102, well, it might not be the best deal for you. So, our basic advice is to make sure that you and your advisors understand the terms of that seller's note, because that's pretty important. Consulting agreement. This comes back to your wish list. Early on in your succession planning, you were supposed to give some thought as to what you might be looking for in terms of employment after the sale. And again, this could range from full-time, it could be part-time, 6 months, 3 months. This is the time to commemorate it in writing and to make sure that both the buyer and the seller agree to the various tasks and roles and the responsibilities that are going to be required and the salary and the wages that are going to be paid for it. And if that has already been laid out for the buyer early on in the process, it's going to be fairly easy to navigate through this. But if you've not given it any thought, it could take a considerable amount of time to solidify this in a written agreement. Your final due diligence, a collaborative effort. This is usually led and coordinated by your intermediary with input and documents from your accountant, your attorney, the lender, and it's a comprehensive set of exhibits that they are going to be needing, and it's going to be set forth in the contract, in the purchase and sale agreement. And it's all going to be needed in preparation for closing. So you're in the final stretch. Once this phase of the process is taking place, you're really in good shape. Once this has been completed and the contracts are signed, and the surveys are done, the inspections are done, the title work is done, and the due diligence material is all collected, it's go time for closing. So adjusting to your new role after the sale. And what you need to remember here is that you are no longer the owner, but you're still a really valuable resource if you're desired by the owner. Now, most owners should look at that and be very welcoming, but it doesn't always happen that way. In our opinion, you ought to be able to work in conjunction with the new owner during this transition period. How much time and that length of time is going to be spelled out in your employment agreement, your consulting agreement. But in reality, you're going to be expected to do anything you can to help this new owner transition into his or her new role as a new owner. You want to act in good faith. You want to support their efforts. You want to make their introductions to families and local clergy, the hospice workers, cemetery, your crematory folks, anybody that you can think of. You also need to know when to back off. If you don't like the color that the new owner is going to paint the foyer, it's really not your call. Even if your great-grandmother picked that color green for that foyer and they're going to paint it yellow, it's just not your call. So there's certain things that are going to be really helpful for the new owner to know, but there are other things that might just be worthy of letting go and not getting hostile about. And this is often a really hard and emotional sometimes transition for the old owner. You also need to know when to ask your advisors for help. If a problem is brewing, don't let it fester. Go to one of your advisors and seek some guidance and see how you can solve it before it amounts to much more than that. And you want to consider the ongoing success of that new business or that business in new hands as a tribute to what you've built and how you've facilitated that sale. You want to take pride in that. I know I've covered a lot of information, and I know I've gone a little bit fast because I'm a little worried about this weather, but hopefully that has given you a comprehensive and detailed overview of some of the most important factors to consider when putting your own succession plan together, and hopefully some tangible ideas for a seller when considering preparing for a sale. I really want to turn some attention to the buying side and buying a funeral home. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of things that a buyer can do to prepare him or herself for a purchase. And also, I think if you've listened in on this, knowing all that a seller should have done can help you be better prepared and have a reasonable set of expectations going into this process of buying. So there is a lot of prep work that can be done to help you on your path to purchase. So what's your situation? What are you trying to accomplish? I think those are good questions to start with. Are you looking to take over your family business? Maybe you're a longtime employee. You want to buy. You want to make sure that you communicate that desire to your owner. First-time buyer of an outside firm. That could be, an exciting time. Maybe you're looking to expand. Maybe you own a firm, looking to expand your existing operations through the acquisition of a nearby firm. Are you suited for ownership? Do you have the drive, the skills, the attention to detail that are required to own and operate a business? Can you tend to and handle business matters and operational and budgetary control? Do you have the managerial skills? You've been in funeral directing long enough. I'm sure that you've got the funeral directing skills, but do you have the people skills? Can you manage your employees and the families? Do you have the creativity and the willingness to try new ideas? Are you committed to putting in long hours? And last but certainly not least, is your family willing to put their support behind you in this endeavor and a necessary investment of time and money? Just as a seller might question if the time is right to sell, you've got to give some thought to the question, is the time right for me to buy? You want to assess your personal situation, your family situation. Do you have their support? Are you looking to have to move? Are you going to uproot your family? If so, are they all ready and willing to help you in that venture? Are they all ready to pick up and move? Do you have the financial resources, cash down payment, maybe investments or equity that you can show? Do you have a good credit history? This is a huge factor when in whether you're going to be able to purchase a firm. If you have poor credit, it is definitely going to prevent you from getting a loan. You could look like the best buyer out there, but if you can't get any financial backing, your deal is dead in the water. So if you're considering making a purchase, but you've got poor credit, get working on it. Start to clean up that credit before you start the buying process. And as a buyer, you want to work on building a solid personal financial statement and a strong net worth. And that's ultimately what a lender is going to be looking for. There's going to be a lot of other factors. When we work with a buyer, we kind of present them as a story to a lender, but ultimately it's going to be on how strong financially you can demonstrate that you are. Financing the deal and knowing your options. Local banks. Some are much better than others. Some local banks just don't have the ability to fund such a deal where so much of the purchase price is really wrapped up in goodwill. Some are able to, so it sometimes does make sense to try this local route. We have a firm in Maine right now, for example, that the local bank beat out several cash flow lenders to make this deal happen. This is unusual, but this local bank was highly motivated to placing a loan because they also held the firm's pre-needs, and they didn't want to lose them, basically. And that's an obvious bonus for a bank. However, in New York State, our state's pre-plan is so strong that most New York State firms don't have the pre-needs in a local bank. So to be honest, this isn't often helpful in getting a local bank in New York to fund a deal. In some other states, it's been helpful. But hey, there's several other very good ways to fund a deal. We found them to be the best, most successful route to financing the deal is through a cash flow lender. Just like we talked about with your industry appraiser, somebody that is experienced in funeral home lending is a must. Whether it's an SBA loan or a conventional loan, these types of lenders really understand the uniqueness of funeral service. And importantly, they understand how the value of a firm is driven by its cash flow. They're typically well-versed at adding back those owner discretionary expenses and those one-time non-recurring expenses like the roof repair, those sorts of things. But they're also expert at not over-lending. So from a buyer standpoint, that's exactly what you want to hear. An experienced, industry-specific cash flow lender is not going to overextend themselves and place a loan that they know you're not going to be able to repay. Could be, you might have an investor. This could be a family member or an outside investor. This type of funding can really help a buyer, especially come up with adequate cash down payment, which maybe they're lacking. You may have a partner. Going into a partnership can be a great way to buy a business. It can lighten the financial burden and the perceived risk involved, but there are many factors that come into play, including whether or not there's enough cash flow to support two partners or however many partners there's going to be, the ownership structure, operating and voting control, so many other issues to make sure that you just want to make sure that it's adequately discussed and agreed upon before entering into such a partnership. And having a solid internal buy-sell agreement is really critical. If you're going to venture into a partnership, make sure that you have an ironclad buy-sell agreement, internal buy-sell agreement. A seller's note. There was a time that many sellers held a note for the entire purchase price for their buyer. In some rather rare circumstances, this is still done, and it often works out very well for both parties. So the option should at least be explored. It does save the buyer a lot of money in terms of closing costs, bank fees, and those sorts of things. And the interest earned goes directly in the pocket of the seller. But there's a lot of risk involved on the seller's behalf, so it's often not very successful. For some sellers, the risk may outweigh the benefit. If you're unable to come up with the entire down payment required by the lender, you will likely need to have the seller hold a seller's note. Again, I know I talked about this before, but it's going to be critical to you to find out from the lender what the terms and conditions are going to be of that note. You are not going to have very much control over that at all, and that should be made clear to the seller from the start, so there's no misperception or false expectations as to how that money is going to be repaid. And as I stated previously, the terms of a seller's note are going to be dictated by the lender. You're really not going to have a whole lot of control over that. I discussed this at length on the seller side, but as a buyer, you're also going to want to assemble your own A-team. We already went over these advisors. I don't need to do that again for you, but it is important to know that you're going to need your own team, basically to keep your own interests, your own best interests protected. So your accountant is going to help weigh in on the financials and the future structure of your company once you purchase it. They're going to want to look at the allocation of the purchase price. Often that's tailored more toward the seller because they're going to have the biggest tax implications, but you want to make sure that allocation is going to work for you as well. So your accountant is going to be the one to best advise you on that. The attorney, obviously your attorney is going to handle all of the legal matters involved. It's going to be important to have an attorney who's well-versed in carrying out transactions. Your appraiser, an appraiser/intermediary, an appraiser can establish a reasonable value for a firm. This is often a very helpful tool, especially in the case where a seller is asking too much for their firm. An industry-specific appraisal based on the firm's cash flow and other pertinent factors that come into play can provide some unbiased guidance, and it really can help get the seller and the buyer on the same page. So what can an intermediary do for a buyer? We already discussed a lot of the ways that an intermediary can support and drive the process for a seller, but there's a lot that they can do on behalf of a buyer, if retained by a buyer. They have access to a database of firms being represented by themselves, by an intermediary. And even though in this case, the intermediary would actually be working for the seller, it can provide you with access to firms that they have listed for sale. So in those instances, they would already have prepared marketing materials. They can also provide you assistance to point you in the direction of good lenders, and with the preparation of a letter of intent and those sorts of things that can help you move along a deal much quicker. With specific representation for a buyer, an intermediary can help with locating firms for sale, and they can give you objectivity when considering a potential purchase. They can really look at it through different eyes. They can provide, as I mentioned before, an appraisal of the firm to determine the affordability of that purchase price, and they can also act as a buffer. That intermediary can be the go-between, and obviously, if working on behalf of the buyer, they can be the one who is the intermediary and the buffer between the seller and his or her advisors. And a buyer is going to help. An intermediary is going to help assist with the structure of the transaction, and will be negotiating on behalf of the buyer for the best price and terms and things like that. And then an intermediary is going to work collaboratively with an attorney on the preparation of agreements, asset purchase agreement, real estate agreement. They're going to make sure that you're adequately protected on the CNC. They're going to do their best to make sure the seller is prevented from competing for the foreseeable future in a reasonable manner. The employment agreement with the seller. Sometimes this gets difficult to navigate. We talked about this earlier from the seller side, where you're going to have certain expectations of the seller's after-sale role that may not align with what they're desirous of doing. So oftentimes it's got to be negotiated with the spirit of compromise. And sometimes the owner may not have even thought this out thoroughly, so they may not even know what they want. The seller's note, we've already talked about that. Just having a clear understanding of what the lender is saying and requiring is really going to be important to you for you to know. Assistance in finding a lender on the buyer's behalf. Often this takes a lot of back and forth and supplying data, asking questions, seeking answers. So a buyer's intermediary addresses all of this and answers questions about the firm's financials and add-backs, historical figures, projections made. And this helps to make sure that the lender understands the firm's historical performance as well as its potential under the buyer's ownership. And again, the intermediary is often the go-between and is going to be the one to request and gather all that necessary information from the other side on your behalf. and this frees you to continue to do what you do. And if you're an employee somewhere, you got to continue to do your job, and you got to keep this confidential. So, it enables you to do that while having the peace of mind that the deal is installing because of missing information. And they also provide expertise in the negotiating process, not paying too much, but being aggressive enough not to lose a deal. And also, if the seller has unreasonable expectations, if they've not had their firm appraised and therefore don't have a reasonable fair value in mind, having someone as your representative can really help the process, either by getting you out of a deal that's not affordable, or by reasoning with the seller and showing them tangible ways and basically helping to get them to better understand its real market value. Assistance with due diligence, we've talked about that before. From the buyer side, there's going to be things that you're going to need to come up with. The financial records, making sure that the structural inspection reads as it should, making sure the firm's in compliance with OSHA, ADA, FTC, EPA, given a thorough review of those pre-needs to make sure they're all in order, that the funds are held as they should be. Even looking at the funeral contract, looking at the funeral goods and services on a funeral-by-funeral basis is going to give you a better idea of what types of calls are being done, what income is being generated from professional services or merchandise, what's being laid out for cash advances. That's going to be super important for you to know, and what their average sale price is on a per-call basis. And inventory is also, they're also going to help to make sure that merchandise inventory and the supplies is kept at about the same level and not depleted just prior to closing. Once you've made your acquisition, you want to make a go of it. You want to work in conjunction with the previous owner during that transition time. Obviously, you need to begin to ease into the transition of staff. You are going to need to have introductions to the community, clergy, cemetery, crematory folks, the community at large, whether it be local churches or organizations, clubs, outreach groups, community restaurants and hotspots. The seller is going to have to help the buyer make his introduction or her introduction to all of these ways to become better known in the community. And at the funeral home, obviously, to make introduction to families, have them on site for certain funerals, visitations, those sorts of things, and also to help you become more known and just to be, just to kind of convey that goodwill to you and carry over that trust that they've given to the old owner. They now want to, you want their blessing, so to speak. And you also want to be introduced to vendors and suppliers and things like that, because I think that's going to be very helpful for you moving forward. After sale advertising and promotions, ads, you may want to do joint press releases, you may want to hold an open house, other events hosted by the funeral home, sponsored by the funeral home, and then you're going to want to do a joint pre-need letter. Obviously, that's got to be done by the letter of the law. New York State is great at helping to navigate that, but it is helpful to do kind of a joint letter that just kind of passes on that goodwill from the old owner to the new. And you and the seller are going to have to determine prior to the completion of the sale just how much is expected of them. Obviously, you need to have a plan, and you got to communicate about it openly. And most often, having the continued goodwill of the owner is really pretty critical to the ongoing success of the firm. So you really do want to navigate that pretty wisely. Making it your own. Oh my goodness, this is everything from soup to nuts here. Everything down to the stationery and your brochure. If you've got printed pamphlets and things like that, your website, your social media presence. Making it known, your signage. I don't know how you are going to want to handle your signage, whether you're going to add your name to it right away or you're not going to. That all needs to be dealt with. Your general price list, your auto burial and casket price list, your facility improvements, I'm sure that you're going to have a to-do list of things that you'd like to do inside and out after a sale. I'm going to suggest that you make a list of those capital improvements and really give priority to certain items. You want to start with those that are necessary. Obviously, a leaking roof is going to take precedence over a couch that needs to be replaced because you don't like the fabric on the on it. But you want to remember that small projects often have a big impact. We talked about this a little bit on the seller side, and hopefully the seller has taken steps to spiff up that facility before they've passed it on to you. But if they haven't, you might need to get to work with some painting, carpeting, window treatments, that sort of thing. And our biggest advice to you is to budget. Save for some of those bigger improvements that are needed, and if at all possible, establish a timeline for completion of these projects into the future. And it's also recommended for the buyer to get a line of credit. This really can help you tremendously if an unforeseen repair becomes necessary and you don't have that excess cash flow to handle it. It just gives you a little bit of peace of mind. Operational improvements, do you need to overhaul it or can you work with what exists? The bookkeeping, record keeping, is it old school, general ledger style, or is it computerized? Is the current system good? Is there a bookkeeper that's going to stay on? Does he or she have a good handle on the income, the costs, the expenses? Do you need a sit down? Typically we recommend doing so. Sit down with your accountant, your bookkeeper, and make sure that your records will be kept clear and accurate. Remember our discussion earlier about the importance of having good record keeping. You really want to start it off the right way. Use of computer technology. There's all kinds of things that you can use it for, and we see a vast underuse of that in the industry for everything: register books, prayer cards, anything else that can be done to offer more personalized, special touches for your families. Maximizing the use of your software. It can do all kinds of things: your death records, vital statistics, funeral contracts, tracking types of calls, your revenue tracking, those sorts of things. It ought to be done with one entry. There are ways to maximize the use of that software, and if you don't know how to do it and your staff members don't know how to do it, give the customer service folks a call and have them walk you through it. It really can save a lot of time and effort and be quite productive. You may want to expand your social media presence on a variety of platforms. Live streaming of services. My goodness, in this last year of COVID, what would we have done without it? Methods to track ongoing performance, customer satisfaction surveys. They're so helpful. Seeking feedback and constructive criticism are a great way to improve and to make changes that are going to bring your firm to the next level. There really are so many things that you can do to improve upon what's already there as your foundation, and I guess our best advice is to start small and build from there. Building a relationship with your employees. You want to watch them in action. You want to listen to them. You want to encourage and listen to their input. Learn from them. You're new to the firm. If you're buying a firm that you didn't work at, if you're coming into a new community, they know your market. So respect that. You may need to retrain, when necessary to suit your style of operation, but recognize and catch your staff doing good stuff. Acknowledge their job well done. It's going to help to bolster their respect for you and yours for them, obviously. It's a great demonstration of that and just creates an overall positive work environment. And you want to embrace changes that are going to improve your firm and seek input from staff members to see if they have any thoughts on might work well for the families that you serve. And as a new owner, I strongly urge you to immediately start doing the things that we've suggested for longtime owners. If you embrace the style of proactive business management, you're going to have a clear path to your own succession planning success. So even though your succession may be far off into the future, especially if you've just bought a firm, you're already going to be building a stronger and better business for when that day comes. And I think that's pretty important. So no matter what your situation, whether you're planning for the short or long-term success of your business, we urge you to plan for your future. so that when you are eventually ready to take that step to transition the business, you're going to be prepared to do so successfully. And as a seller, you're going to want to have, you're going to have put in a tremendous amount of time to build your firm to be the best that it can be. And with that, you'll have the greatest chance to maximize your sale price. And as a buyer, being knowledgeable and informed, duly prepared, and asking all the right questions is going to help you on the path to ownership and put you on the road to creating your own path for success. So I know this is a lot of information. I know I kind of went through the end of it fairly quickly. Hope you're all still on the other end. We didn't lose any power. I'm glad about that. But I hope that this at least provided you with some understandable guidance and some tangible ways to take charge of your future. So if anybody's got any questions or comments or anything like that, I'd be more than happy to weigh in on those.
Yeah, we have a couple questions already, and I'll remind anyone that has questions, now would be a good time to type them in and we can get them answered. Would you recommend an inspection of the building and its assets, electric, plumbing, HVAC, etc.?
Yes. Yes. It is going to be, that's a great question. If you are, if a seller is, let's say, I'm going to say 3 years out, and just trying to get things in order, absolutely. If there's an issue, it's going to be found. And, if you don't know about it now, it's going to be found out just prior to closing. Usually those inspections and things like that are usually ordered, I'm going to say, maybe 6 weeks prior to closing. So you don't want those things to be found then. I mean, if you don't have the time to do it and you don't have the cash flow to do it, there's a lot of people who don't opt to do it. But if you've got the time and the money and the wherewithal, absolutely, I think that it would be very, very wise to get a handle on that. It just makes you much more prepared going into a sale, and document it. If you have all of those things done and you make, you take the time and do some remedial work, have it documented for sure, so that with certainty that, if it's inspected, 3-4 years later on and, close to closing and a question arises, you can say, nope, had that inspected, had that repaired, just make sure that it's documented for sure.
Great. And this question actually came in prior to you discussing this portion, but the question is, are you a firm believer in covenants not to compete?
That's a good question. I would say 99.9% of the deals that we do, there's always a covenant not to compete. Are they enforceable? At the end of the day, you're a funeral director. You really, I guess in a court of law, can you really be prevented from making a living? But that said, from an ethical standpoint, you really ought to not compete. So you would have a court battle. If you had a covenant not to compete and you violated it, let's say, you are going to be brought to court. Whether you win or whether you lose remains to be seen. That's dependent upon the judge and how it's looked upon. There are a lot of states where a covenant not to compete is really not all that enforceable, but as a good faith gesture, we do like to see a covenant not to compete. That said, we like to see those covenant not to compete to be very reasonable. Let's say you are in the Capital District, okay, and you've got a buddy down here near us in Ulster County that you want to be able to go and, help him out on occasion if he needs it. Well, there's no way that that's competition. So we like to make sure that, we know when we're involved, if you've got a situation like that and you're a funeral director or a funeral home owner and you're selling up in the Capital District, but yet you've got a friend down here in Ulster County that you want to occasionally be able to help, we would write that in, and make sure that that was known, and also make sure that that radius did not extend to, that would be a really far radius from the Capital District to Ulster County, but you get the idea. If you were looking to be restrictive, we typically like to look at depending upon where you're located, not more than a 25-mile radius. it, but the good faith behind it, I think, is really what most buyers and sellers really like to look at, is that you're not going to go sell this firm to this person and then go work with your competitor next door, because that's going to be a huge detriment to the ongoing success of that business. So that's really the why they exist. And yes, we do, from an ethical standpoint, we really do like to see a covenant not to compete, a fair covenant not to compete.
If the previous owner took pre-plan money and either purposely or accidentally did not set up a proper pre-plan account, who is responsible? The previous owner or the new owner?
Well, why you want a good due diligence and why you want good people on your side is to find out before you sign on the dotted line. So that should be all found prior to a closing, and it would all be the responsibility of the seller.
Great. And the only other question we have right now is, will this PowerPoint be available following the program?
Sure, Kelly, I can email it to you, or they could email me and I can email it to them, however you want to handle that. But yes, absolutely, I can get this to you.
Great. And we had a couple more questions come in. What is the typical percentage that you will see the seller hold for the buyer?
That's a good question. We usually see, it depends on how much cash the buyer has. So typically speaking, a cash flow lender is going to look for the buyer to have about 20% of the purchase price in terms of a cash at closing. So let's say a buyer only has 10% of that. The seller is going to be asked to hold the remaining 10% to make up that 20%. So, if you've got a well-positioned buyer that's coming to the table with a whole lot of cash, that seller's note is going to be even smaller. So most lenders are not going to let a buyer come to the table with zero cash. They have to have their feet held to the fire too. It can't be all of the risk of the seller. So typically it's 5 to 10% of the purchase price. 10% is probably a reasonable amount, but sometimes depending upon how much or how little cash a buyer has, it could be more. It could be up to 20%. Not usually that whole amount, but.
And he's also asking what the typical interest rate is.
Right now, the interest rate is so low, it's crazy. With the bank, usually a cash flow lender is able to split the loan into two parts, real estate and the business. So a blended rate right now, oh my gosh, like 6-7%. I mean, right now it's really pretty good percent. Looking at a blended rate, and of course that depends on credit and credit worthiness, and and all that sort of thing. But interest rates right now are just still so low.
Are many firms sold without the real property?
That's a good question. For a buyer, they typically are going to need to have that real estate involved. Here's a scenario. So if a lender is going to come in and look at my funeral home, and it's really without the real estate, other than the cars and some furniture and equipment, there's really no assets. So there's really not a lot to collateralize. So for a lender, without that real estate, it's really hard to sink their teeth into, because if the buyer should default, what are they going to take back? They're going to take back a funeral home. They don't know how to run a funeral home, So a lot of times a buyer is going to need to have that real estate involved just for the mere fact that there's collateral. The other aspect of that, though, is when there is no real estate involved, having the real estate involved enables the amortization of the loan to be a longer term. So let's say with the real estate and the business included, the amortization of that note could be 20 years. Take that real estate out, a lender's probably going to step up that amortization to a 10-year, which makes it not so affordable. It just makes for a higher monthly payment. So it changes the whole dynamic of it. Now that said, it's not impossible. We do see situations where, a buyer may come in and buy the business and lease the real estate for a couple of years with the, the right of first refusal to purchase that real estate. But typically speaking, most deals that are done, the real estate is included.
And then these next two questions kind of go together. Speaking of a consulting company like ASD, is the team paid on a percentage, or do they have hourly rates, or how does that work?
Yep, that's a great question. We price ourselves very differently than an accountant or an attorney, and we may even price ourselves different than some other folks that are out there that do what we do. So that's a really good question to pose to. I'll answer it for AFC, but it's a really good question to pose to some others out there because they may be priced very differently than us. The way we structure, let's say we're working for a seller, the way we price ourselves is a commission-based, and it's based on a sliding scale, and it's based on a percentage of the purchase price. So, for example, our fee structure is 5% of the first $1 million in sale dollars, plus 4% on the second $1 million in sale dollars, plus 3% on the third $1 million, and thereafter. So essentially, we do a whole lot for less than what a real estate broker would get on a deal. We've got a house that we're selling right now, and our broker is she's wonderful, and she's charging us 6%. So, but we then do whatever it takes. I mean, I tell you, sometimes we work on deals for years. I'm sure some of you out there are rolling your eyes because we've worked with you. Sometimes things just get bogged down. Sometimes things happen and it just gets delayed. Sometimes the banks delay, or there's all kinds of things that can run in, interference, I should say, in delaying a deal. So we will, from start to finish, it could be an 18-month process, and we're all in, and we get paid at closing. We usually get an upfront retainer. I think we get a retainer of like $4,000 upfront, and then that's credited back upon a successful closing. That's credited back to credited back on the final fee. So that's how our fee structures work. It's 5-4-3 sliding scale, based upon the purchase price. Okay,
great. That looks to be the end of our questions. Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us today for the presentation. If anyone has any questions, they can certainly reach out to us, and we can connect you with Melissa or Kathy, or their email address here is right on the screen. As I said before, please give us 7 to 10 business days to get these CEUs updated to the portal and to get your certificate out. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it very much. Thanks, Kelly.